I've cooked hundreds of briskets on almost every type of smoker imaginable, and what I can tell you with confidence is that most briskets will finish in the temperature zone of 190 to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you need to spend at least 30 minutes to 2 hours in that temperature zone until the brisket probes tender like room temperature butter, and when you pick up the brisket, with gloved hands obviously, the brisket should feel kind of flexible and gelatinous. But that information alone won't help you because you're missing a lot of pieces of the puzzle. For example, what does probe tenderness even mean? Where do you probe for tenderness? And when do you start probing for tenderness? I'm gonna answer all those questions in this video, along with giving you guys a foolproof technique for probing brisket that'll give you a perfect brisket every time. And I'll finish off the video with some troubleshooting techniques so that you can perfect the art of smoking brisket. Let's get smoking. This technique works for the most common method of cooking brisket, which is about 225 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit cooking temperature, wrapped in butcher paper or foil at around the 165 to 180 internal mark, and finished at 195 to 203 internal, with a total cook time of around 12 to 14 hours. It also works for hot and fast methods, but if you're using a different cooking method like super low and slow on a pellet grill for 18 hours, for example, then I'll get to that later in the video, but this method won't work as well because your brisket will finish at a much lower temperature with those super long cooks. So in terms of setup, I like to monitor my brisket temperature with a leave-in probe thermometer like the Chefstemp Quad XPro, which is the sponsor for this video. This unit tracks 4 different probes and has min-max alarms to let me know exactly when I'm hitting certain temperature targets. I put one probe in the point, one probe in the flat, and then a third probe monitors the ambient temperature right where the heat hits the meat. I then set my min-max alarms to notify me if the temperature falls above or below a certain temperature. For example, I'll set the ambient probe to alarm if the temperature falls below 200 or above 300 degrees so I can manage the fire more effectively. It also has 500 feet of RF range, so I can monitor temperatures from anywhere in my house and don't have to rely on spotty Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, whether I'm at home, at a friend's house, or at a barbecue competition. If you're looking for a leave-in thermometer, I'll leave a link in the description section below to check it out, and a discount code if you want to pick one up. When the brisket hits an internal temperature of 180, let me assure you it's probably not done, but this is when I start doing my initial probing for tenderness. The reason I recommend this initial check is because you probably haven't smoked 100 briskets and developed an innate feeling for what a brisket feels like when it's perfectly done. So the best way I found to get a feel for it really quickly, even if it's your first brisket, is to probe it earlier in the cook to get a baseline feeling for tenderness. So I'll probe the thickest part of the flat right under the point. This is usually the holdout zone that finishes last, and then I'll probe the flat and I'll probe the point. Note how each of them feel. Note the resistance going in and out. Was it hard to pull the probe out and the brisket wanted to kind of tug and pull? Was the point a lot softer than the flat? Take note of all of these things. I also find it helpful to give the probe a few taps as it comes out because it gives me a better sense of the resistance. Now continue to cook the brisket until it reaches 195 to 203 degrees internal. This is the ideal range to finish a brisket because the temperature is high enough that the brisket is probably already done or very soon will be, and it's low enough that it's probably not overcooked. So when it hits 195, turn your cooker down to 200 degrees Fahrenheit ambient temperature. There's no need to continue cooking at 225 or 275 or 300 or whatever temperature you're cooking it at. The brisket doesn't need much more heat or energy to hit the finish line, and by decreasing your temperatures to 200, you widen that window of perfect doneness and ensure you won't overshoot it. After you turn the temperature down, start probing like you did before. Does it feel the same as when you first probed it at 180, or does it feel like it has kind of no resistance at all? If it feels like there's almost no resistance on the probe compared to when you first started probing it, it's probably probe tender at this point and it's done. It's common to feel like the point has no resistance at all, but the flat has some resistance and tugs at the probe. This is normal, and it causes a lot of beginners to continue cooking and potentially overcook the brisket. Instead, think about how the flat probes now compared to when you first started probing it. If it's the same resistance, keep cooking and check back every 30 minutes. If there's much less resistance in the flat than before when you first started checking it, it's probably done, even if it's not as tender as the point. Okay, now that you know enough to be dangerous, let's go over some advanced finishing tips to help you really dial in your brisket cooking skills. Tip number 1, here's something that might shock you. Brisket will finish at any temperature you want it to finish at. Brisket is complex. It's kind of like a fine IPA, which, as an aside, I know really well because IPAs are kind of like the PSLs for basic bearded barbecue dads like me. Unlike other cuts of meat, finishing a brisket is a function of time as well as temperature. That's because it's packed full of thick interconnected tissue called collagen that surrounds the individual muscle fibers. In order to produce juicy, tender brisket, this collagen needs to be sufficiently cooked so that it becomes softer and at least partially converts into gelatin. And that process doesn't just happen instantly at certain temperatures. Regardless of the internal temperature you cook it to, if you don't cook it long enough, it'll be like chewing on shoe leather. And if you cook it too long, it'll completely lose its structure and your brisket will just kind of crumble apart and be dry when you slice into it. Let's look at this chart to help us visualize it. Collagen starts to break down at around 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So really, the process of tenderizing the brisket starts at that temperature. At 145, it could take 2 days to fully break down the collagen. That's too long for most of us, unless we're doing a sous vide or confit brisket, which I've done before, and I'll include links to them so you can check out those videos. Moving up to 165, it could take 24 hours at that temperature, being held at a perfect 165 to perfectly finish the brisket. And at 170, it could take 6 hours. And at 190, it could take 2 hours. And finally, at 203 degrees plus, it could take only a few minutes to fully render all of that collagen, which is why most recipes say to aim for 203 degrees Fahrenheit as a finishing temperature. At that temperature, it's a safe bet that the collagen will be rendered, but your brisket could also be overcooked very quickly at that temperature. Now, you've probably noticed something artificial about this chart. In reality, we don't instantly start a brisket at 190 degrees and hold it there for 2 hours. What actually happens is we start a brisket off at fridge temperature, that's around 40 degrees, and then it goes up to 165 in about 4 or 5 hours. It holds at 165 to 170 for a few hours during the stall. Then it pushes past the stall and quickly rises in temperature after we wrap it. And then it stays in the 190 zone for maybe 30 minutes before it gets to 200. But what this chart is helpful for understanding is how time at certain temperatures might affect when your brisket is done. If my brisket had a really unusually long stall, maybe it was injected or just had a ton of moisture and it stayed in the stall for 6 hours or 7 hours, I would then know that it wouldn't need as long when it gets to higher temperatures to finish. So for example, if it felt like it was probing tender at 190 internal, and that's not normal for most of my cooks, I would understand that it's actually probably done because it had more time to cook during that longer stall period. On the flip side, if I'm doing a hot and fast brisket at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, the brisket might zoom through the stall and hit 190 within a few hours. Knowing that it hasn't had as much time to render the connective tissue, I might take it to a higher finishing temperature like 203 and hold it there for a longer period of time until it probes tender. And because I understand the concept of collagen breakdown as a function of time and temperature, I won't freak out when my brisket is super tough, even though the internal temperature is 203 degrees and I think it should be done. I'll know that it just needs a little bit more time at that higher temperature because the total cook time was much shorter. And finally, if I'm doing a sous vide or confit brisket, I'll pull the brisket off the smoker at 165. It won't be near probe tender, but I know that it'll finish perfectly after being in the sous vide bath at 155 for 18 to 20 hours. And guys, keep in mind that this chart is for illustrative purposes only. These numbers don't mean anything. It's just to relay the concept to you. Tip number 2, brisket will overcook if you put it right into a cooler after you pull it from the smoker. It's called carryover cooking. Think back to the chart. If you pull a brisket from the smoker and put it right in a cooler at 203 degrees internal, it's going to continue to hold above 190 for a really long period of time, and that's going to continue to cook and probably overcook your brisket. So if you want to put it in a cooler, please vent it first and then leave it on the counter for at least 15 to 30 minutes so it stops carryover cooking so quickly. Then you can put it back in the cooler and you can hold it for several hours. Tip number 3, at a bare minimum, a brisket needs to be rested for at least 2 hours until it comes down to a temperature of 140 to 150 degrees internal. Otherwise, it's going to oxidize and dry out very quickly when you slice into it, and it's going to taste drier regardless of whether you pulled it off the smoker at the exact right time. Tip number 4, you can hold your brisket in your oven, a toaster oven, an electric smoker at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 to 16 hours, as long as there's sufficient humidity and moisture
temperature in the cooking environment and you don't go higher than 150, the juiciness and consistency of your brisket will be enhanced. I did a bunch of videos testing these various methods, so I'll link them here. Keep in mind your brisket will continue to cook during the hold period, so if your brisket was overcooked when you removed it from the smoker, it's going to get even more overcooked during that long hold. But you can also use this to your advantage. You can actually pull your brisket off the smoker at around 190 internal. Even if it doesn't probe tender at all, it'll finish perfectly during that long hold at 150 for the next 10 to 16 hours. Tip number 5, brisket is large, oblong, and made up of 2 muscles. It doesn't cook evenly even in the best of conditions, and it cooks even less evenly when we put it in a smoker with the heat primarily coming from one direction. With an offset smoker, the heat is coming from the firebox and going up and over the brisket in most cases. Sometimes if you have baffles and tuning plates, it'll come from below, but in most cases it's hitting that point muscle and cooking it a lot faster than the flat behind it. So the point probes tender even though the flat may feel tough. To prevent this, you can use foil on the point after a while to slow it down, or rotate the brisket and foil the flat so it cooks more evenly. Again, having a probe in the point and flat like I have set up with my Quad XPro will really help you see how evenly the brisket is cooking and adjust accordingly. Don't be afraid to strategically spritz the edges, foil, rotate, or use wood blockers at different points of the cook to help your brisket cook more evenly. It's just going to turn out better if you do. As for pellet grills, they tend to cook the flat faster because radiant heat from the deflector plate below the brisket transfers a lot more energy to the flat than the point gets from the convective air currents at the top of the cook chamber. Temperature is not energy, and even though your pellet grill is set to 225 degrees Fahrenheit, the radiant heat from below packs a ton of energy and can really overcook the flat quickly. You can avoid this by flipping and rotating the brisket, cooking fat side down, or by using a water pan below the brisket as a buffer. Tip number 6, the grade of your brisket will affect how it feels when it probes tender. For example, a prime grade brisket has a ton of intramuscular fat, and it'll feel a lot more tender when you probe into it. Conversely, a select grade brisket with very little fat might feel a bit tougher when you probe it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not done. That's why I like my technique of doing a landmarking probe for tenderness earlier in the cook at 180, because when we're talking about probe tenderness, what we're really talking about is relative probe tenderness. How probe tender is the brisket compared to how it was earlier in the cook. Tip number 7, beware of false positives. You can get tricked into thinking a brisket is probe tender when it's actually not even close to being done. Or conversely, you can get tricked into thinking it's not probe tender when actually it is. Here are a few examples. Let's talk about false toughness. A dried out flat is pretty common for a lot of people. If you burnt it early in the cook and the flat didn't cook evenly, let's say you got a lot of direct radiant energy from that deflector plate in your pellet smoker, then the flat is going to be really dry and it's going to be tough to probe even though it's done. It doesn't have as much moisture in it at that point, and it's just not going to probe as tender as the point. Now let's talk about false tenderness. You can get this when you're using Wagyu Angus crossbreed briskets, for example. They may probe very tender early in the cook, but that's because they have such a large honeycomb structure of collagen compared to regular Angus breeds that it kind of masks the fact that the collagen is not fully rendered. The collagen density of an Angus brisket is much more dense than a Wagyu Angus crossbreed brisket. So when you slide your probe into a Wagyu Angus cross brisket, it can be presented with much less resistance than with a Wagyu brisket. There's an article on it that I'll link here if you want to look into this, but there's not much more that you need to know here other than that if you're cooking Wangus briskets, that's Wagyu Angus cross briskets, they might probe a little tender earlier in the cook, even though they need more time. And really, the perfect doneness for those types of briskets just comes with experience. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you want to talk all things brisket related and talk more about finishing your brisket perfectly, consider checking out my Patreon page. I'll link it in the description section below. We're building an awesome little community there where we all share pictures of what we're cooking and our smokers and deal with common challenges. So I hope I'll see you there, and I'll definitely see you in the next video. Again, if you guys want to check out the Quad XPro and consider purchasing it, I'll link it in the description section below with a discount code so you can get your own Quad XPro.